After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Imagine a world where every government action provokes a strong reaction that affects both ordinary people and the business elite. When US President Donald Trump decided to strike a blow to his country's economy by raising tariffs on steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%, it was reality. Moreover, you would be mistaken to think that this would be limited to corporations and major players. This decision affected the entire industry, from automotive to aviation.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Today, we will tell you how one economic decision caused a real crisis in the aviation industry and threatened tens of thousands of jobs. Companies such as Boeing faced enormous problems that brought America to its knees. The future of airlines and the lives of thousands of Americans depended on the success of the government's actions. Have you ever thought about what happens when a single economic decision triggers a chain reaction that threatens an entire industry? At the center of these events was Boeing, the largest player in the aviation industry. The cost of materials skyrocketed, and the company's factories began to experience a shortage of components. Workers were working at full capacity, fearing layoffs due to rumors of plant closures and flight cancellations.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
However, this was only the beginning. Trump made the situation worse by imposing new tariffs on cars and components in April 2025. Supply chains became unpredictable, and rising component prices caused real panic. Although the economic changes seemed insignificant, their consequences were catastrophic. The cost of aircraft skyrocketed, leading to millions of dollars in losses and a loss of trust among partners.
Tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
However, that's not all. Tariffs also had an impact on other sectors of the economy. To avoid tariffs, major airlines such as Alaska Airlines canceled flights and diverted planes to Europe. This was already a breaking point for the US aviation industry. In addition, the automotive industry also faced job cuts, falling production, and losses. Industry giants such as Ford and Stellantis also faced these challenges. What is the reason for this crisis? What do political decisions that threaten everyone from workers to industry giants mean? How could these events change the character of the United States? Stay tuned to find out about the consequences of economic policy and who will ultimately be on the brink of destruction.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
When US President Donald Trump announced an increase in tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50% in 2018, no one expected how devastating it would be for the US economy. Although this decision was a turning point in his trade war with China, no one could have predicted that it would have such enormous consequences. According to Trump, it would boost domestic production, create new jobs, and reduce dependence on imports. However, this has not been the case. The first effects were felt almost immediately in US industry. The tariff increase led to serious disruptions in supply chains as many American companies, including automotive and aviation companies, relied on cheap imported materials. This led to a deterioration in production processes and higher prices for a number of goods. Many companies were unable to cope with rising aluminum and steel prices due to restrictions on imports. Many small and medium-sized enterprises found themselves on the brink of bankruptcy due to worsening supply problems. For example, some car factories announced a 30% reduction in production, and company executives began discussing possible mass layoffs. Boeing was one of the biggest victims of this decision. By 2025, the company faced a major crisis due to rising component costs. All components needed to build aircraft became significantly more expensive due to higher steel and aluminum prices. Due to instability in supply chains, the company also faced problems with the delivery of vital materials. Boeing, which has a huge number of contractors and a global supply network, considers these delays extremely unfavorable. But that's not all. At the same time, Boeing faced a sharp decline in demand for new aircraft.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
With rising product prices, many airlines have been forced to reduce their orders. When giant airlines such as Alaska Airlines and Delta began cutting back on purchases, Boeing found itself in an extremely vulnerable position. Rumors of plant closures spread like wildfire, and workers became increasingly anxious. Workers worked around the clock, not knowing when they might be laid off, fearing that their jobs would be replaced by automated systems, or that the plants would simply close. Reports of mass layoffs began to appear in the media, adding to the panic.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
But the problem was not limited to the aviation industry. The tariffs had a significant impact on the country's economy. At first, it affected car companies, which also made cars out of aluminum and steel. For example, Ford predicted losses of more than $2 billion as a result of the tariff increases. With sales dropping sharply, a lot of jobs were at risk. Problems in the automotive industry led to massive plant closures, leaving hundreds of workers in different states out of work. As demand for cars declined, companies were forced to either cut production or raise prices for their vehicles, putting even more jobs at risk.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
At this point, the aviation industry's situation worsened. It is said that major airlines such as Delta may try to avoid new tariffs by abandoning American aircraft. As a result, European competitors such as Airbus have begun to actively sell their aircraft, which are not subject to the new tariffs. The air transport market is going through difficult times. Airlines that have recently grown are facing rising costs and falling demand. One of the most shocking decisions was Ryanair's decision to terminate its contract with Boeing. The company said it could not continue working with the American aircraft manufacturer if prices continued to rise.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
The U.S. has faced huge problems in its key industries as a result of the tariff crisis. Alcoa and other steel and aluminum producers began to cut production, which also affected the economy as a whole. With each passing month, these problems became more apparent, and the shock of the tariffs dealt a real blow to American industry. Despite criticism, President Trump continued to argue that these measures were a necessary economic adjustment that would help restore jobs in American factories and reduce dependence on imports. But people on the ground were losing their jobs, and companies that still had jobs were struggling to survive, while the government boasted about its policies.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
When President Trump again raised tariffs on imports of cars, parts, and raw materials in April 2025, it seemed that the crisis caused by the previous measures could not get any worse. However, this move proved even more devastating. The situation in the U.S. economy, particularly in key sectors such as aviation and automotive, became catastrophic. Production declined further and unemployment rose due to supply problems and high material prices. Once upon a time, supply chains seemed to be growing stronger by the day, but now they are tangled like a giant web. Entangled in a maze of rising prices and high tariffs, companies such as Boeing faced new challenges. High tariffs threatened not only material costs but also logistics, without which the company could not function. Airplanes cannot be built from steel and aluminum alone, but also from a multitude of other parts that are now significantly more expensive. Unable to withstand the price increases, many suppliers began to cancel contracts, putting the company at risk of serious disruptions in the production process. Although some experts expected Boeing to close its factories, the company faced a sharp drop in demand for its products. Airlines began looking for other options as prices for new aircraft rose and old contracts with Boeing were gradually terminated. Some airlines began to reduce the number of aircraft they were ordering, while others sought to purchase cheaper aircraft from competitors such as Airbus. After it became known in May 2025 that several major carriers were redirecting some of their orders to the European manufacturer, Boeing came under even greater pressure. But the most notable example is the decision by Ryanair, one of Boeing's largest customers. The budget airline, which is one of the largest in Europe, abruptly announced its intention to terminate its contract with the American giant. Their statement emphasized that American products were becoming too expensive for their budget due to high tariffs on aircraft and components. As a result, they decided to look for alternatives. This news had a stunning impact on the market and made many experts wonder how far the aviation industry crisis could go. Rumors of mass layoffs as a result of these economic problems began to spread within the company itself. Realizing that their jobs were at risk, workers began working 7 days a week, performing their duties at full capacity, but knew that this might not be enough. Fears of layoffs intensified as new contracts disappeared and old deliveries were called into question. The situation at the company worsened day by day, and several plants were forced to take a technical break due to the deteriorating situation. However, apart from Boeing, other industries began to feel the effects of the crisis, especially in the automotive industry. Steel and aluminum tariffs were terrible. U.S. car manufacturers such as Ford and General Motors found themselves in an extremely difficult situation. With rising metal prices and new restrictions on imports of spare parts, car production deteriorated. It was reported that Ford expected losses of $2.5 billion due to the new tariffs. Even large companies such as Stellantis faced difficulties and were forced to cut 900 jobs at 5 plants. One of the most alarming signs was the news that several large factories were on the verge of closure. Many factory workers had decades of experience and were unable to find work elsewhere, leaving them in despair. After production lines were shut down, empty warehouses turned into ghost towns. Aluminum and steel tariffs continued to rise, and the economy faced much more serious consequences than expected, instead of solving the problem. Although many economists and analysts argued that these measures could destroy the auto industry, Trump continued to insist that they were necessary to correct unfair trade with China and other countries. However, the situation was deteriorating not only in the United States but also abroad. For example, manufacturing companies in Canada also began to suspend operations due to the doubling of tariffs. Some Canadian companies that had long supplied products to the United States now found that their goods had become too expensive for American consumers. As a result, a number of airlines in Europe, such as Ryanair, have begun to hint at terminating their contracts with Boeing, which has further exacerbated economic instability in the market. In response to the growing problems, Trump continued to argue these problems were an integral part of his economic correction policy, rather than just temporary problems. The pressure on the US economy is becoming increasingly apparent. As the threat of economic depression became a reality, political support for the tariff policy began to wane. Nevertheless, Trump insisted that his decision could not be changed by economic problems. At the same time, the problems caused by the tariffs became increasingly apparent in other countries, which only exacerbated tensions at the international level. The tariffs on steel and aluminum imposed by Trump affected industries in the United States and around the world. Companies such as Boeing and Ford began to suffer serious financial losses, which led to negative consequences for global trade and the economy. The tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum doubled in Canada, a country that has traditionally been an important trading partner of the United States. This led to the suspension of operations at many large enterprises. Factories that previously manufactured goods for American corporations are now on the verge of bankruptcy. As a result, Canadian workers began to protest, and some businessmen suffering from increased duties began to demand that the US government change its trade policy. Nevertheless, Trump insisted that the tariffs were a necessary step to improve the trade balance, despite the protests. But it is not only the US and Canada that have faced problems with tariffs. European companies have also begun to experience serious problems. For example, Ryanair, Europe's largest budget airline, began to threaten to terminate its contract with Boeing. The company stated that purchasing American aircraft was economically unviable due to high prices. This decision worsened the situation for American manufacturers, who were already facing a decline in orders. In early June 2025, Ryanair officially announced the termination of its contract with Boeing for the purchase of 10 long-haul aircraft. The American company began trying to negotiate with the Europeans in response, but was unsuccessful. Production of new aircraft and orders for them continued to decline, which had a negative impact on the company's financial results. Boeing faced difficulties in attracting new customers, and its old orders began to be cancelled one after another. At the same time, more and more countries began to understand how high tariffs affect their economies. For example, China began to openly discuss the introduction of retaliatory duties on goods imported from the United States. Chinese government officials said that the US should be prepared for the consequences of its policies because the economic war started by Trump could have a global impact. Chinese analysts predict that if the situation continues to deteriorate, the United States could find itself isolated, which could lead to a sharp decline in export opportunities for American manufacturers. This could exacerbate the crisis and lead to job losses in the United States. In response to these threats, Trump reiterated that China had underestimated the strength of the American economy and that the tariffs that had been imposed would remain in place. As a result of trade wars with China and other countries, the global economy faced unprecedented challenges. Many countries began to lose their positions in world trade due to sharp fluctuations in the prices of goods and services on international markets. As the world's largest economy, the United States became more vulnerable in the market. At the same time, slowdowns in shipments and rising prices for goods have threatened the economies of many of the United States' partner countries, such as Canada, Germany, and Japan. For example, when car prices began to rise in Europe, airlines began to face customer service problems due to a shortage of aircraft, which worsened the overall situation in the industry. Large companies such as Airbus also began to increase production to capture the market vacated by the American Boeing and strengthen their position. This was another victory for the Europeans, albeit a hard-won one. Meanwhile, problems also arose in the United States. Companies such as Ford and General Motors feared increased losses and therefore postponed their plans to expand production. Millions of people work in the automotive sector. Millions of workers in the United States found themselves in a situation where their jobs were threatened by expected losses from higher tariffs. With each passing day, it is becoming increasingly clear that Trump's tariffs have not led to job recovery. On the contrary, they have accelerated layoffs and slowed economic growth. Domestic protests began to grow, and more business people and workers demanded that the president review his trade policy. Changes in U.S. policy were one of the most notable consequences of the introduction of tariffs. In response to Trump's declining approval ratings, Democrats began calling for an investigation into his trade decisions, claiming that they would negatively affect the economy and Americans. Trump's decision has been heavily criticized by the opposition, which argues that it will worsen the lives of Americans and exacerbate international relations. Despite growing discontent at home and abroad, the president continued to argue that tariffs were a necessary step to restore the U.S. economy. The uncertainty caused by the trade wars continued to dominate global news. The global economy was on the brink of a deep crisis. Although many experts predicted that the United States would eventually emerge from the situation, the consequences for jobs, industry, and financial stability were inevitable.